So a lot is being stated by the experts over the subject of health, and it's being said that it's one of the biggest sectors if it's addressed at the right time. And one of the problems that developing states have is the sector of health. It badly needs to be addressed. It was being felt by the experts, but suddenly doctors didn't used to talk about this issue. They always used to say, whenever we'll ask them questions, they would come up with the answers. It's not up to us. We can't suddenly one day change everything. The health sector is a very broad sector. It can't be done in one day. Suddenly, why are they having butterflies in the stomach? I have attended some conferences and seminars as well of late, and where this draft drug policy is being discussed, and they say there are a lot of problems associated with the sector of health. Why so? Aren't they comfortable with the draft drug policy, or they have their own grievances with the system?
Maybe doctors will be in a better position to respond to this, but some data I would like to quote over here. In a recent study, it has been found that first of all, at the national level within India, more than 500 pharmaceutical companies owe Government of India a mammoth amount of 4,000 crores on account of overcharging of drugs. So and on the other hand, there is a study from Vietnam which says that more than 40% of the cost of medicines goes into bribing the doctors. But I don't know, there are no such studies available within India or within J&K which would establish this.
That's why this concept of cut practice is gaining ominous proportions.
Yes, there. One thing I would like to reiterate is that yes, the good prescribing practices we don't have in our state. So this drug policy envisages to ensure good prescribing practices, and it envisages to streamline the promotion and marketing practices of drugs. Basically, in the earlier draft, there were no such provisions laid out how to control this unethical marketing of drugs by pharmaceutical companies and unethical prescription of drugs by certain unscrupulous doctors. I won't say all of them, but there are certain elements in that fraternity which resort to unethical prescriptions. So actually we had suggested the government to enforce and invoke the Medical Council of India Code of Ethics, which has recently been modified in December 2010, but unfortunately in the final draft,
to tackle that nexus that doctors have with the people with the pharma industry,
to devise the ethical practices which need to be there when the doctors are prescribing medicines, and how, to what extent the pharmaceutical company can go in promoting its products, what practices they can adopt in publicizing and accessing the doctors or influencing the doctors. So but unfortunately that provision has been dropped. The government did not somehow include that provision, and besides that provision there are some other suggestions. Some of the suggestions were included by the government, but some were dropped. But if that had been adopted, there would have been to a large extent this could have been curbed to a very great extent, because such people are bringing bad name to the entire fraternity.
For the sake of the viewers, could you please explain what this cut practice means?
Yeah, actually at national level, this is a problem with many of the developing countries, not only with India, that pharmaceutical companies resort to unethical promotion practices in order to promote their medicines, and they go to any extent to bribe the doctors. They sponsor their tours, they sponsor their 5-star visits, they give them gifts, and sometimes which are
that means in exchange of a refrigerator I might get a paracetamol.
That's quite possible, and in order to curb those, but that's not a practice which is prevalent only to this state. It's a worldwide practice seen in majority of the developing nations. That needs to be tackled, and there has to be proper rules and regulations have to be there which will take care of that. So basically the reason for overcharging of drugs to the tune of 4,000 crores is the same. That is, the Indian pharmaceutical corporate body doesn't want any new policy to come up at the national level. As a result, at national level today we have a national drug policy of 1986. Since then, as many as 3 attempts have been made by Government of India in 2000, 2002 and 2006 to bring in a new pharmaceutical policy, but somehow this corporate lobby has succeeded in sabotaging those attempts, and today we have a policy which has been framed in 1986 at national level, which has been modified only once in 1994.
But we can say better late than never. If in some states has been introduced where it has not taken off. You said since 1986 it was being proposed but nothing happened, but if some good step is taken by the government, we need to laud that.
Exactly. Now we have come to the main point, that is the drug policy which has been drafted by the J&K government may have certain strengths, may have certain weaknesses. There are plus points, there are minus points also. But the fact of the matter is that we have to implement some policy framework. We need to have some statement which will guide us, which will lay a roadmap how to proceed in the coming years. We cannot continue without a policy for another decade or so. So for so long we had no policy framework for all the issues concerning procurement, for all the issues concerning safe use of drugs.
I did talk to some doctors. They said that this policy that is being proposed, it's being made chemist centered who doesn't know anything about the pharmacies. Is it being made chemist centered, where the onus would be on the chemist? Whatever he prescribes, now it's up to him. The pen passes from the doctor's pocket to the chemist's hands.
No, as long as government succeeds in keeping generic medicines available within the hospital throughout the year without letting any stockouts to take place, the chemist will not get an opportunity to replace the generic medicines prescribed by the doctor inside the hospital with a generic or a branded medicine of their own choice. But if the government fails and if there are stockouts, there are no drugs available within the hospital, then of course that will happen. The chemist will replace the drugs of their depending on their profit margins. But if we go by the inherent design of the policy, the drugs have to be made available throughout the year within the hospitals, and there should be no stockouts, so that all the inpatients, all the outpatients get their medicines within the hospital based on the generic names, and none of the prescriptions should actually go out of the hospital. But that depends upon the implementing agencies, on the government, how well they are able to ensure the proper implementation of the policy, and that also depends on how good procurement policy is. Unfortunately, the procurement part is still in doldrums. They don't have a very foolproof and effective procurement policy as of now. Earlier they had promised that we will go by the Tamil Nadu Medical Supplies Corporation model in the earlier draft, but when the final draft came, they said that we will just improve the existing mechanisms, but it is very hard to improve the existing mechanisms. They cannot change overnight because existing mechanisms are full of faults and flaws, and government needs to devise a proper, foolproof, effective, concrete procurement policy wherein all there has to be transparency, it has to be a constraint free mechanism, as is the case with Tamil Nadu Medical Sales Corporation. Actually, Tamil Nadu Medical Supplies Corporation has provided us a ray of hope. Despite all odds, they have made good quality generics available in the government hospitals at affordable prices.
They are a benchmark to us.
They are a benchmark, and if sometimes we say that there is corruption here, but there may be corruption in Tamil Nadu also. So in spite of that, they have made it possible to make drugs available. They have moved on. So we need to follow the footprints of Tamil Nadu Medical Supplies Corporation.
I talked to some people, the stakeholders of this pharma industry, and they said that if this policy is implemented, it would bring the spurious and adulterated medicines in the market.
No, that's not practically possible, because usually if you talk about, for example, counterfeit notes are made for 500 rupee notes, 1000 rupee notes, not for 5 rupee or 10 rupee notes, because there is a lot of investment in manufacturing for counterfeit currency also. Same is the case with drugs. Generic drugs are so cheap that it is very difficult to make counterfeits.
You had made a mention of it in your article as well.
Yes, exactly. It's very difficult to make counterfeits of cheap generic drugs, because the processing cost will be higher than the actual generic cost. So usually the counterfeit drugs or spurious drugs are made for branded medicines, which are high-end medicines, costly medicines, and
not for generic drugs.
Not for generic drugs. And the policy has already devised that the J&K state will be having intelligence cum legal cell. That was actually the suggestion made by Civil Society Forum, of which I was a member, and we had made that suggestion. And they have also included the part that there will be incentives for informers, because usually drug inspected staff doesn't get to know where the spurious drugs are, how they are flowing. They are very sophisticated rackets. It is very hard to bust those rackets in a routine manner. So there has to be some intelligence cell, some legal cell. Yes, well-informed people. The network between states. There has to be effective legislation, and this has to be made cognizable and not bailable. And there has to be this special courts have to be designated, which can take up such cases on fast track basis. Then only this curbing of spurious drugs will become possible. But generic drugs as such has no impact on the spurious drug industry, if at all there exists one.
But our sympathies go for the people who are associated with the drug industry, particularly medical representatives. They'll be out of jobs. What will happen to them? What are the alternatives for them now?
No,
on
actually,
the humanitarian grounds. So we have to think about them as well.
on humanitarian grounds, the government has to think, everybody has to think, there have to be proper redressal of their grievances. Whatever their genuine grievances are, the government must take due care of them, and they must devise alternatives how to handle those. But as I earlier mentioned, that it's not fact that all the government representatives will be rendered jobless, because still there is a huge private sector which is open. Now in private sector we may not have well established private hospitals, but there is a mushroom growth of pharmaceutical stores, drug stores, which are in every nook and corner of the valley. In every lane and byline we have a medical store, and we have people practicing in evening hours, in morning hours. We have doctors who are doing private practice. So it's not the chapter closed for medical representatives once the policy comes in. Still the private sector will be open to them, and whatever dependence on the government sector, that needs to be ascertained by the government, the exact magnitude of that dependence, and accordingly the suitable modalities can be devised. As I said, that we can initially have these generic medicines only for BPL patients, and for the affluent people we can continue with the branded medicines, at least in the first phase of the policy implementation, until all the hurdles are overcome and all the hiccups are sorted out.
Learning from experts, they say that there should be a very cautious and careful approach from the government. What point wise, what do you think should be the points that the government needs to be taken into consideration before implementing this policy, which has stirred up a hornet's nest?
Yes, there are, I have mentioned in one of my articles, there are still a lot of deficiencies and lot of discrepancies in the final draft which has been approved by the state cabinet, but that can be handled and catered to in the due course of time, because anyhow we cannot stop the implementation of the policy, but once the time comes for revision of the policy, that time we can address those grievances and those discrepancies. But one most important discrepancy, apart from streamlining the procurement mechanism, the procurement policy, that is one grievance. The second being the drug licensing part. Still the licenses are being issued to unqualified people based on registration given by the J&K Pharmacy Council. So any Tom, Dick and Harry can approach.
At the drop of the hat, you get the licenses.
Yes, any Tom, Dick and Harry can approach the J&K Pharmacy Council, and he can get himself registered, then he can get a drug license. That needs to be stopped. J&K Pharmacy Council needs to be reconstituted. It needs to devise the education regulations, and it needs to stop registering people who are not having a pharmacy qualification. So the issuance of licenses must be restricted only to people having a degree or a diploma in pharmacy, because this uncontrolled proliferation of medical stores is the root cause of all the problems. Once a person who has entered unscrupulously into this trade without any basic qualification, he resorts to sale of spurious medicines,
and then he says my employment is being hampered because of this.
Yes.
And they say ignorance of law is no excuse.
Exactly, and he is the one who indulges in drug addiction, who indulges in unethical prescribing and unethical dispensing. So that is in my opinion, the mother of all evils is the unregulated licensing of drug stores. That needs to be immediately stopped and regulated, and the registration part needs to be streamlined. The State Pharmacy Council needs to be reconstituted. They need to come up immediately with education regulations, and that only will stop that practice. Once that is done, the implementation of the policy will become easier, because the market will be streamlined, and then the government has to take into consideration the grievances of the trade, pharmaceutical traders, the medical representatives, whoever are associated with it, and it needs to be worked out what is the actual dependence on the government sector and how their problems can be redressed. That is one important thing which government needs to consider seriously.
Appreciated your coming, Dr. Gir Mohammad Ishaq. It was a privilege and pleasure talking to you.
Same here. Thanks a lot.
So viewers, we were talking on draft drug policy with Dr. Gir Mohammad Ishaq, who is Senior Assistant Professor at the Department of Pharmaceutical Studies, University of Kashmir. We'll be having a panel discussion on this subject as well, where we'll be inviting the people from the pharmaceutical industry, the experts and the doctors, while we'll be having a debate over this subject, and all sides, all opinions would be counted here.